I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think it probably is.
Oh, because there's
And-
special situation.
Yes, that's right.
Time to start. Okay, it's just that this is milk, but I also brought powdered milk.
Yes, yes, yes. New South Wales is very close. So many
A bit blurry, isn't it? But we're good to go. Some blurry for me.
Shadow image behind it that's making it look a little bit blurry.
Yeah. Right, well,
Ready?
ready.
Okay.
I haven't got a Bible, but
well,
No, okay. And Fran is going
Is it recording already? So is it?
And I know I can see very cute bottle or cup.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Nice to welcome you all here again. Nice to be here. A little bit of a break for the holidays. Hope you had a good time.
Yeah.
Yes, kids enjoy the holidays.
Well, it was lockdown for some of the time.
Wow. Also locked down by the rain too. Very wet.
Yeah, weather is not good.
Not good for a school holiday. No, never mind. Oh, well. Anyway, we're going to move on this evening. The last class we considered the birth of Moses and how he was, when he thought he was ready to deliver Israel, he was not. And God sent him into the wilderness for 40 years to mind some sheep and then said, now you're ready. He said, I don't think I'm ready for anything. But in God's view, he was ready to look after the people of Israel. So tonight we're going to look at Israel leaving Egypt. And as usual, we'll commence with prayer. Almighty Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth, we bow before you as the only true and living God, that we might learn from the things that you have written, that we might learn about men and women of faith and faithless from previous ages, that we might be able to be encouraged in our life to serve you and to worship you today. We honour you in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our presenter for tonight, Dan Jolly, to lead us in the series of the study, Israel in the Wilderness. Thanks, Dan.
thanks, Greg, and good evening, everybody. Tonight, I'm just making sure that the video doesn't look completely ridiculous. There we go. It just looks somewhat ridiculous. Good. So tonight we're going to talk about the departure of Israel from Egypt and then their journey into the wilderness. And this is easily one of the most exciting stories in the Bible. But before we get there, who can remind me, how did Israel get into Egypt? Yeah, how did they arrive in Egypt? I mean, the Israelites were not Egyptian people, were they?
Yeah, because Joseph,
Go on.
yeah, Joseph sold to Egypt, and his real member grew up so long.
He was a slave.
He was a slave, exactly.
Yeah.
But as a slave, what happened to him? Did he stay a slave, or did he get promoted?
Sorry?
Did he stay a slave, Joseph? Or,
Joseph, no, Joseph is
second in command
yeah.
to Pharaoh, the
Yeah,
king.
Pharaoh, yeah.
Absolutely right. And then there was a famine.
Thank you.
Remember? So there was no food. Not anywhere in the region, not just Egypt, anywhere in the region in the Middle East. There was no food. And what happened because there was no food? Who went to Egypt where Joseph had been preparing food?
Brothers.
That's right, exactly right. So the whole family of Jacob, whose other name was Israel, moved down to Egypt because in Egypt there was food and their brother was the second to Pharaoh. And they stayed there for year after year after year until, well, like any visitor, they had become part of the furniture. But unfortunately, as we saw last week, there was a new king, a new Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph, and he oppressed them. And this is exactly what God had said would happen. God had actually said this would happen to Abraham. Way back, hundreds of years earlier now. God had said to Abraham, your whole family, Abraham, will go into the land of slavery. And after a long time, I will bring them out. Jacob had been told this as well. Jacob had been said, your family will go down to Egypt. And after you're dead, they will depart Egypt. So there were many prophecies predicting the events that we're going to look at. And so now we've come to the point where there's a reason. The people of Israel and Egypt are in terrible trouble because the king, Pharaoh, is trying to conduct genocide, isn't he? He's trying to kill all the boys. You can have girls, but no boys. So eventually there would be no Israel, no males to continue the family. But Israel were leadership. They were weak. Moses thought he could be the leader, and God said, no, you're not ready, as Greg said, until he was not ready. And then God said, now you're ready. It's such a wonderful thing about our God. He knows the right person to make into a leader, and Moses was to be a wonderful leader. And so our story for tonight really begins when God spoke to Moses and said to him, look, now's the time. He said to Moses, out in the wilderness, I want you to go back to Egypt, as it says in this passage, go back to Egypt, and you are going to do miracles. What's a miracle?
In America, normal people can make these things. Just the God can make.
That's right. Miracles, that the word actually means something amazing, something wonderful, and at the same time terrible. We're going to see that as this story continues. And this man, Pharaoh, was specially selected by God. If Pharaoh was a weak man, Moses would do the first miracle and he'd say, oh, that's okay, you can all go. There would just be one miracle, but we're going to see not one, not two, not three, but 10 massive miracles. I want you to imagine, if you will, that each of these miracles is about the same size for Egypt as the pandemic is for us in Australia. They were really, really big things. Imagine being in a country that had not one pandemic in a year, but 10 in just months. The country would be broken. And that's what we're going to see in our story as God performs miracles to convince Pharaoh and the world to let these people go. And so Moses went to Pharaoh, and God had said, this is what you've got to say to Pharaoh when you go and see him. You've got to say, thus says the Lord, Israel's my child, my firstborn child. Let my son go, If you don't let my son go, says God, I'll kill yours. What a scary thing to say. And yet, God was going to do this. By the end of our story tonight, God will kill Pharaoh's firstborn child. But there's something wonderful I want to just briefly touch on in this sentence, because I think this is wonderful for you and for me. This word here, firstborn. What, Claire, do you want to have a crack at it? What do you think it means if I say someone is a firstborn? It's what it sounds like, isn't it? The firstborn. But you see, it kind of suggests something else is possible. Because if you are, for example, I am my father's firstborn. But if I was my father's only son, you wouldn't call me the firstborn, you'd say my only. My dad would say, this is my only son, but I'm not. I'm one of three. I'm the firstborn. And so to say the firstborn means there will be others. Otherwise, you say the only son, don't you? Who do you think the other sons of God are?
Firstborn heritage some property, heritage.
Oh, the firstborn,
Yeah.
that's the heritage of his
Yeah.
father.
Yeah.
Yes, so the firstborn son does get a special gift from the
Yeah.
father, of course. But the idea we're trying to talk about here is that because there is this idea of God having a firstborn, it suggests that God will have maybe a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a thousandth, a millionth son. Who are they? And the answer is, well, we hope they are you and me. Chinese and Australian and English and American and Canadian and Vietnamese and Brazilian and children from all around the world will be the sons and daughters of God. And it's hidden in that phrase, firstborn. God was saying, I will have others. It's just Israel's the start. I think that's wonderful. All right, so here comes Moses. And Moses was very insecure by this point. When he was younger, he was proud. He thought he could do anything. He was a superman. But now he's worried and nervous. He feels like he can't talk clearly. So he says to God, I can't talk. He actually says, one of my most favorite phrases in the Old Testament, I have never been eloquent, nor hitherto have been, or words to that effect, which in English is a way of saying, I'm not good at speaking by using words that prove you're good at speaking. It probably wasn't anything like that. But nonetheless, Moses felt like he couldn't speak well. And so he asked for someone else to be the speaker. God said, well, you can take your brother, Aaron, your older brother, and he can go and be with you. And he'll be, if you like, someone to give you courage and someone to say words for you when you can't find the right words. And so Moses walks into the throne room of Pharaoh, at the time, the most powerful man in the world. The biggest army, the largest empire, the longest running empire. And here comes Moses, and he's going to say, you must let these people go. They're mine, not yours. And Pharaoh rejects him. Not interested, sorry. Who are you? And who is your God? This man did not know Moses, or if he did, he only knew of him distantly. This is a new Pharaoh from even the time when Moses had left. And so now he's trying to introduce not just himself, but the fact that he has the voice. He is the voice of God's people. And so, as God said, he had to prove to Pharaoh that he was somebody who should be listened to. And more than that, more importantly, that the God he claimed to speak for was real. this is the same problem we face today. How do we prove to others and to ourselves that our God is real? Well, God gave Moses a solution that isn't the same solution we have today: miracles. And here's the first of them. The first of the miracles was that he turned the water into blood. Now, I don't know, you probably did this at school. Do you remember that thing at school where you've got a glass flask and it was clear, and you poured in another clear chemical, 2 clear chemicals, and it goes red? Do you remember that? They call it an indicator. They pour in an indicator. So 2 chemicals, both of them water in color. You mix them together and it goes red. This is very common magic trick. Well, you might have imagined that was what was going to happen here. But you see, what happened was Aaron held his staff, his stick, over the river Nile, and the whole river turned to blood. So it wasn't just that the water went red, it actually turned into a different chemical. The water wasn't colored, it was blood. And all the animals in that river died. The fish floated to the surface, whoop, dead, because you can't swim in blood and survive. And it stank like a river full of blood would. Now, the magicians of Egypt were able to do a similar trick. They turned water to blood as well. They probably did the one I just told you about, where they would stir a chemical in and it would make fluid turn red. But the Nile River had been turned to blood. Now, that's a terrible thing for a nation that depends on the river for its water. Have any of you been to Egypt? I know Greg's been to Egypt. You've been to Egypt, haven't you? Anyone else? Big river, little creek. What's the Nile like, Greg?
Well, it's quite a big river in its mouth, where Cairo is. Further up you go nowadays, of course, they've got the Aswan Dam there. It's deprived the river of a lot of its size and quantity of water.
Yep. This river is responsible for the drinking water and the water for irrigation for millions of people. It's not a little creek, it's a very, very big river turned to blood.
The only place in Egypt that people live is on the edge of the Nile Valley. So you've got the Nile and a bit of a valley on either side of it. If you look at a Google map of Egypt, you'll see that it's all desert everywhere except down the edge of the Nile. It's the only place most people live. You might get some Bedouins living at other little oases, but most people just live on the very edge of the Nile in Egypt.
Yeah, exactly right. So he made the river blood. Now, you might think, okay, wonderful trick. What was the result of what Moses was demanding of Pharaoh and these miracles? Well, remember the children of Israel were slaves. They had a job to do in Egypt, and the job they were being given was the job of big construction projects. The children of Israel were there to ensure that there was material for the Egyptians' construction. And so they were making bricks, and from those bricks, doubtless making buildings. And these were clay bricks. To make them strong, they had to be mixed with straw or something to give them a bit more strength, a bit like we'd use fiberglass today. The consequence of Moses speaking to Pharaoh and demanding the children of Israel being freed was that Pharaoh made the life of the rest of the people of Israel much worse. In the past, Pharaoh had supplied some of the raw ingredients required to make these bricks for these construction projects. Now Pharaoh stopped providing those materials, the straw, for example, to go into those bricks. And he demanded that the children of Israel not only built the same amount of bricks and the same amount of construction, but they found their own straw as well. And so as Moses goes on demanding that Pharaoh frees the children of Israel, Pharaoh, in response, makes things more and more difficult for the children of Israel. So this is a battle of sorts. It's a war of two men, two people, Pharaoh and God. And they are fighting against each other, but they're fighting through proxies. Pharaoh is using his slave masters to punish the children of Israel. And God is using Moses to perform miracles that punish Egypt. It's two great forces clashing against each other. We'll see who will win fairly soon. But this first miracle, water turned to blood. Well, the magicians of Egypt could do a very similar thing, and Pharaoh was not impressed. And so Moses was forced to do another miracle. He created a plague of frogs. Actually, this is the only place in the Old Testament frogs are mentioned. There's no other story in the whole of the Bible where there are frogs. In the Old Testament, I should say. There's one in the New. And these frogs, they weren't just sort of breeding in the river. They were everywhere. They were appearing in people's houses and in their bread tins, in their fridges, in their beds. They were finding frogs everywhere. And this didn't just affect Pharaoh, it affected everybody from the most wealthy person through to the poorest person. And not only the Egyptians, the Israelites as well. Everywhere you went in Egypt, there were just frogs everywhere. Now again, the magicians were able to do a similar trick. No doubt, somehow they did some sort of magic thing where they, see this hat, it's empty, you can see empty hat. Look what I've got in here, I've got a frog, ta-da! See, I can do the same thing as Moses. We were not able to replicate exactly what Moses did by making billions of frogs breed like that overnight. But they were able to make frogs appear and to amaze Pharaoh enough that he was not impressed by what Moses had done.
You mentioned hopping into bed and there's some frogs in there and the oven and there's some frogs in your oven and frogs everywhere.
It would have been absolutely revolting. It makes the specific point that the bread was in the place where they made, the frogs were in the place where they made bread. Can you just imagine it? Sort of unwrapping your bread, you take a little plastic clip off and unwrap the plastic and pull out the loaf and cut through. And oh no, I thought I'd got fruit and nut and I've got frog again. It would have been horrible opening up your bread and discovering, that smells of frog. So it was an amazing thing. All the rivers, canals. Egypt is full of canals. So what happens is the river runs through Egypt, and then to get the water out into the fields, they have canals that run, and it's smaller and smaller the further you get, but the water's running downhill away from the river into the fields. God elsewhere says that Egypt is a land that can be watered with the foot. And what that means is you'd have these little gullies running into your field, and you just kick some dirt into that kind of little gully where the water would run along, and that would stop the water running. Then you kick the dirt out of the way and the water would start running again down the trench and into your field and water your field. It says that the frogs were in those little gullies. Everywhere you went, you go way out into distant fields in Egypt where there'd be this little house and this little Egyptian family living, and there were frogs there as well. Everywhere you went, there were frogs. And Pharaoh said to Moses, please, this is revolting. My guys can do the same thing, but what I can't do, and I can't get them to do for me because I already asked, is get them to get rid of your stinking frogs. Please pray to God for me to get rid of these frogs, and I'll be very grateful. And Moses is still trying to work with Pharaoh. He says, look, Pharaoh, just to show that I'm still respectful of you. You tell me when to get rid of the frogs, and I'll do it at the time you say. That'll do two things. It'll give you a sense of control, but it'll also show that God can do things like that. You say 10:45 and the frogs will disappear at 10:45. Pharaoh says, just how arrogant is this? Do it tomorrow. Now, if it were me and my whole kingdom was being ruined by frogs, the bread trade destroyed because no one wants to buy sourdough frog bread, I'd be saying, get rid of it now. Don't wait till tomorrow. Do it today. But he, so arrogant, he says, oh, tomorrow. And Moses said, okay, tomorrow. And the next day, the frogs went. Well, not completely. There were still frogs in the river where they should have been all along. They shouldn't be in people's beds and in their bread tins. But they were still in the river, and all the rest had gone. The frogs died out, and they died. They had to be gathered up, and there were these great big piles of frogs everywhere you went across Egypt, reminding people of what had happened. But Pharaoh didn't respond to that either. And he wouldn't listen to Moses anymore. And so God said to Moses, all right, tomorrow, stretch your staff out again and smash it on the ground. And the dust will whirl up, and that dust will turn into something. It'll turn into gnats. Now, do you have a word for gnats in Chinese? Yeah. What's another? I guess we could say, let's go with mosquitoes. That's close enough, Greg, would you say? They're a little biting insect. Yes, a flea. That's right. They're a flea. And they sort of crawl on you and they make little biting, they bite you, little itchy bites. Very small. So they're not, I don't think they're midges, maybe? We don't really have them here, but nonetheless, midges. So we call them midges. So they're not a mosquito as such. There's little flying bug. Billions of them everywhere. You go, right? But they'd be all over you and on your arms.
If you look at the passage in the Bible, it'll give you the Chinese.
Oh, very good idea. So could you turn up page 98, Exodus chapter 8 and verse, Wendy, do you want to read chapter 8, Exodus 8, verse 16? So page 97, in fact.
97.
Yep, bottom of the page.
Sorry, which was?
Exodus 8, verse 16.
Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt.
Now, what's the Chinese word there for gnats?
Yeah, the similar.
What does that mean in Chinese?
Flea.
Flea, there you are, fleas. Fleas, so itchy fleas everywhere you go, on man and on beast. And so Pharaoh calls in his magicians. Now this is just, it shows you how stupid Pharaoh was. And he said to them, oh, can you do this too? Who would want more fleas? Like he hasn't got enough fleas already. But the magician said, no, we can't do this. This is nothing else but the finger of God. Now the magicians are forced to admit that nobody can do what's happening here. This is God's power alone. But somehow, Pharaoh still did not believe and would not let the children of Israel go. And so God said to Moses, get up early in the morning. This time I want you to hijack him. I want you to sort of jump out on him. He's going to go down to the river for a bath tomorrow morning. I want you to meet him as he goes down to the river, jump out at him and say to him, let my people go. If you don't, it's not bees, it's going to be flies. Swarms of flies, and they'll fill your house, and they'll fill the ground, and they'll fill your beds, and they'll sit on you. But do you know what I'll do this time? this time, just so you can see that this is personal, I'm angry with you, Pharaoh. The flies will only land on Egyptians. They will not land on my Jewish people who live in the land of Goshen. So they lived in a slightly different area, like a ghetto, if you like, a little bit further towards the coast. And of course, Pharaoh didn't listen, did he? He was too proud, and the next day, flies everywhere. Now, we know what flies are like in Western Australia, that time of year where the flies are just like this. But have any of you been to Northern Territory? Don, you haven't? Wow. So on the road up towards past Alice Springs, at various points of the year, you get these big swarms of flies coming through. And so you'll be driving along and think, oh, step out, stretch my legs as we're driving, step out. And immediately you have so many flies on you that you look black. Flies are, and they're in your mouth, and they're sort of in your eyes, trying to drink the fluid from the edges of your eyes, and they're everywhere. This would have been like that. As you'd walk, you just see this black blob walking, and as it walked, the flies would go, and there's a man under there. He'd stop, down there, come again. Flies everywhere, until he finally got to Goshen, and he'd go to Goshen, and here's the border between Egypt and Goshen. He'd step across, and the flies would stay there. Step back, flies, step across. Because the flies would not go into Goshen to show God's power. God commanded the flies that they stayed in the land of Egypt. An amazing thing. And now Pharaoh was learning the power of God. God's power was not indiscriminate. I mean, that's a very specific thing to say, isn't it? That the flies will not go in. How do you stop flies going? Like, was there a training program for the flies? And they had to sort of teach the flies how do you do that? But God did. And he stopped the flies going into Goshen. And now this time, it was so horrible. The flies in Pharaoh's mouth, he'd say, try and make a new law. You know, for example, the new speed limit for the Cairo area will be 60 kilometers per hour, not 50. And as he tries to make, in comes a fly, and he's coughing, and it would have been absolutely horrible. And so he says to Moses, you can go. Finally, Pharaoh says, you can go. Go and sacrifice to your God. But I want you to do it here in Egypt. You're not allowed to leave. You can have your day off for a sacrifice, but you can't leave. And Moses says, well, look, I'm glad you've come to that conclusion, but we need to leave. We have to go 3 days journey out into the wilderness. And Pharaoh says, all right, I'll let you do that, but please don't go very far away, and talk to God to get rid of the flies. And so Moses did. He talked to God to not get rid of the flies, and the flies disappeared, and Pharaoh sent a message. Moses, I changed my mind. You can't leave. You can't take the people. There'll be no sacrifices. And so God said to Moses, all right, I want you to go in and tell them to let my people go again. And if you don't, now it's going to start getting expensive. We're done with uncomfortable. Now we're going to move to expensive. And what God did is he sent a plague, a disease upon the livestock. A terrible disease, so that the livestock of the Egyptians started dying. In my Bible, it was called murrain, I think was the term used. In this Bible, it says a severe plague, a livestock plague. Maybe it was mad cow disease, who knows? But again, it was only on the Egyptians. Now imagine you're a normal Egyptian. You've got nothing to do with Pharaoh, apart from the fact he's just changed the speed limit in Cairo. And you're just trying to live your life, but the decisions he's making have caused no water for a few days, just blood, and then frogs, and then gnats, and then flies, And then what was, sorry, I missed one in there. No, that's it. And then flies, and he's sort of going, this has been a horrible month. This has been revolting. I wish Pharaoh would just deal with this. But now Pharaoh's made a decision, and you lose money, because that's what an animal represents. A big part of the people's money, and the animals died all across Egypt, but not one of the Jewish animals died. In fact, it was so remarkable that there were animals in the Israel area that were on their last legs the day before. I think the cow's going to die. But it stayed alive, just to make that point, that not one animal in the Jewish territory died. But Pharaoh still did not listen. And then God said to Moses, all right, this time I want you to take some soot. Go and take some like ash out of one of the brick kilns children of Israel are using. Take some ash and go into the throne room of Pharaoh and chuck it up in the air. Now, Pharaoh was used to this sort of thing now. He'd seen it from Moses a lot. And as he did it, Pharaoh would have thought, oh, that's a bit uncomfortable. What's going on? Oh, yeah, there's a boil on the back of my neck. And all of a sudden, all across Egypt, people started breaking out in boils. Do you know what boils are? Big lumps, painful lumps all over their bodies. So, Susan, do you want to read for us chapter 9? So it's page 99. Almost at the bottom there, if you could read verse 9 and 10.
It shall come flat dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beasts throughout all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast.
All right, so
A kiln is the place where
they cook bricks
cook bricks.
Yep.
It's a fire.
for drying things. But so verse 10, what's the Chinese word for boils there?
I don't know, some of the skin is broken.
Yeah.
Some water come out.
Yeah, that's right. So it
Very painful. Yeah.
very painful, and not just on the people, on the animals that had survived. So imagine that. You can't even get to sleep, not just because you're uncomfortable, but because the animals outside are making noise. The chickens all night because they're uncomfortable, because they've got boils too. It would have been very, very uncomfortable.
Boils can be like this big, or even bigger. Like it starts big, you can have a small boil, but as in here, some of those boils would have been huge with a big, what we call a head on, and the head is full of pus, where the body is sending the germs out of the body. The body
Yeah.
is fighting it.
Yeah.
Very bad.
And this one was kind of amusing because Pharaoh, it seems, sent a message to his magicians. He sent out a message saying, come quick, we need to work out what to do about these boils. And every one of them sent back a message saying, sorry, I'm going to have a sick day. I can't come. I've got boils. Probably they didn't all realize that everyone else had boils for a little while, but not one of the magicians could come in to face Moses because they had boils all over their bodies. And so it would have felt very personal. But this next one now is bigger again. This one would have been really, really terrifying. Moses was to go into Pharaoh and say to him, "Thus says the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, because this time what I'm going to send upon you will prove to you that there is no other power in the world that can do this." In other words, this next one is going to be huge. Only a God could do this. Well, what happened? Of course, Pharaoh didn't listen. We know Pharaoh well by now. He's got an ego and he's very, very arrogant and proud. And so he didn't listen. And what God sent was something really interesting. It's not something we've seen in recent history. Part of it was hail. Hailstones. We know hailstones. But it says it was hailstones mingled with fire.
Excuse me 1 minute. Do you know hail? Yeah. Hail, little ice cubes that come down from the sky. You know, when the ice comes down instead of rain.
And you go out and you collect it and put it in the freezer so you can put it in drinks. Little square things falling from the... No, I'm joking. However, it was mixed with fire, and you think, well, how is it mixed with fire? Well, the only way that could happen is if there was some atmospheric or seismic event that meant that what was falling out of the sky was maybe bitumen or still burning ash or something like that, but there was something mixed in with it that just made it absolutely terrible. And it was also mixed with, like a volcano. And it appears that it was mixed with lightning as well. So this would have been absolutely terrifying. But before it happened, Moses said to Pharaoh, "Now look, this one's going to be really bad. You need to tell everybody to get inside and tell them to bring all their animals inside, because if you don't, they're dead." Of course, Pharaoh, he ignored all this. And people stayed outside and they died from the hail. Now, I want you to think about it for a minute. You're not going to die from a hailstone this big. It's going to hurt, but you won't die. We've had hailstorms with stones that big here in Perth. This is a storm that will kill people with hail. Now that gives you an indication that the hailstones were probably very big. And we're told it destroyed the land of Egypt. There was thunder, there was lightning, there was fire, setting fire to the crops, and mingled with that with these great rocks of ice falling out of the sky. And what was worst about it was in the middle of the harvest season. So all of the people were out in the fields harvesting their flax and their barley, and they died trying to harvest their crops. And their crops were destroyed as well. This would have been terrible because it would have meant that the food for certainly for the cattle for the next year was not available. And yet, once again, Pharaoh did not listen. So they've lost many of their livestock. They've now lost many of their crops. They're now going to lose everything that's left, because God is sending a plague of locusts. Now, we have locust plagues today. They swirl out of Western Africa sometimes, other times up from Saudi Arabia, and they move. They're huge clouds in their hundreds of millions, billions, even tens of billions of insects swooping down on fields and wiping out everything in that field. And when a locust plague lands, we see these today. There's plenty of them happening around the world. When they leave, there's nothing alive in that field. They kill the trees, they kill the grass, they kill everything. They're so hungry and ferocious. And God sent a plague of locusts. And they flew into houses and filled up the houses. You'd be walking to bed, crunching across the carcasses of locusts. And all that was left was an empty desert land. And now Pharaoh's ministers come into him. The prime, there would have been the head, the sort of minister for the economy, and the minister for home affairs, and the minister for social services. And they all come into Pharaoh and say, "You've got to stop this, Pharaoh. You have to let these people go. They are killing us. We lost our cattle, and then we lost our barley crop and our flax crop. That was the hail. And now we've lost our wheat crop. There's nothing left to eat. We're going to starve." And so Moses and Aaron were dragged back in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, "Go on then, go and serve your God. Go on." And Moses said, "All right, we'll go. We'll take our young and our old and our flocks and everything we've got, we're going." And Pharaoh said, "Look, you can go. You can take your little ones." "Well, no, actually, I've changed my mind. Just you go. Just the men. Leave the women. Leave the babies behind." Well, that was a trap, wasn't it? Pharaoh was trying to make sure that they had to come back and stay slaves. And so the locusts came and went, and then God sent the next plague. Here's the next plague. This one's fun. This is one of my favorite plagues. I like the picture for it because it's a perfect picture for the plague.
Yeah, it's black.
Darkness. But this was not any old darkness. We have darkness right now. You go outside and there's darkness. You see, this was a special darkness. It was an unusual darkness because you could switch the light and you walk inside, click, on would go the light. Oh, the bulb must be blowing. So you go into another room and switch on the light. The bulb's blowing. Even if you had a light, you could not see light. It was so dark, it says it could almost be touched. You could feel the dark. And yet, once again, if you went into Goshen, they've got lights in Goshen. But back in Egypt, darkness. Absolute darkness. They did not see each other. In fact, people didn't bother getting out of bed, it says. For 3 days. For 3 days. Because if you got out of bed, what could you do? You'd think, I'll be right when I go outside. Oh, I can't see outside. And trip over the coffee table and you way to the front door and get outside and trip over the cow that's still there, it's dead. It would have been absolutely horrible. And they could not see a thing, even in the daytime. And so Pharaoh calls in Moses and says, "Go on, go with you." But this time he says they can take their families, their children, but not their cattle. Can't take their possessions. They can't take the cows and the chickens or any of that sort of thing. They can just take their family. And again, this was a trap. Pharaoh was trying to stop them escaping. But Moses knows he's now at the end. This is the last, almost the last one. And so Pharaoh says, "Get out. Never come and see me again." And Moses says, "I don't want to. I'm never going to see you again." There's one more plague coming. This was the last plague, and this plague changed things completely. It changed it from being Pharaoh was willing to let them go to Pharaoh and all of Egypt wanted them gone. This plague, well, I don't know if you can see it down here. Death of the firstborn. And we want to have a little bit more of a look at that one because you see, the children of Israel now knew that they were going to leave. God gave them very special and particular instructions of how to prepare for their departure. They would have a special feast. So what was to happen was this. If you were a Jewish person, you were to go and get a lamb, a little baby sheep, and you were to sort of take it and bring it and make a little pen, a little sort of enclosure for it next to your house so that your kids could come and pat it and you could hand feed it. It was to stay there for 10 days. Then you had to go out and kill it, your pet. And they were to take the blood, they would get a bit of the blood from this dead lamb, and they were to get a bush, and they were to go up to the door of their house, and they were to paint round the edges of the door of their house with blood. So that when you came, you go, oh, into that door. You'll go into that. Did you know you've got blood on your door? There would be blood all around the door of the Jewish houses. It was a very special instruction. And then they were to cook that lamb, cook it in a particular way. They weren't allowed to break the lamb. So normally, if you're cutting meat and you're preparing it, so break it up and have steak over it. No, they had to cook it whole. And they had to eat all of it. To eat all of this lamb. And they had some other things. They had to get bitter herbs. Now, it's a very strange thing to be told to get. Get some vegetables. Okay, no worries. Make sure they taste terrible. What, really? What? Yep, just the ones that taste horrible. Only those vegetables. What about some pumpkin? No, just the yucky ones. God said he wanted them to cook it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. In other words, bread that has not risen. It's flat bread with no yeast in it. In fact, they would clean out their houses and make sure they had no yeast in their house. And on top of that, they were to eat this food dressed in a particular way. They had to be dressed ready to run. So they had to have their coat on and their clothes on. They had to have their stick by their side. They had to have all their belongings packaged up, and they had to be ready to run. Imagine that. You're in this house and you're eating this meal with your family, and everybody's ready. They know something's going to happen. And something did, because in the night, an angel flew overhead. Now, flew is probably the wrong word. An angel moved throughout the land of Egypt. And that angel was checking doors. And where the angel saw a door that had blood on it, the angel would not go in. But where the angel saw a door that had no blood on it, the angel would enter. Didn't matter who it was, Jew or Egyptian. If there was blood on the door, the angel stayed out. If there was no blood, the angel would go in, and the oldest, the firstborn child in that house would die. And of course, if there were several generations in that house, then maybe more than one person would die. If there was, grandpa who was the firstborn, and dad who was the firstborn, and the son who was the first, you could have 3 generations die in a single house. And so overnight, all through Egypt, where there was no blood on the doorposts, firstborns died. Can you imagine what that would have been like? You'd have heard sobbing. All the Israelites are there eating their lamb, terrible herbs, and all around them they can hear people crying. Today, if it happened, all around you'd hear sirens as ambulances are coming. Of course, they didn't have ambulances in those days, but just imagine how that would seem. The eerie sound of people sobbing, echoing down all of the streets. All through Egypt, people were crying. And in Pharaoh's house, they were crying too, because Pharaoh lost his firstborn son. The children of Israel were so glad that God protected them on that occasion. And so they departed. They left and they walked out of Egypt that night. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just Israelites who went. There were Egyptians who came too. Through all of those terrible plagues and all those terrible things, there were some, not a lot, but some Egyptians who'd come to the Jewish people and said, only a God can do these things. How do we get on your side? How can we be with your God? And there would have been some Jewish families who made friends with Egyptian families, and they'd have gone and said, tonight, make sure you put some of this blood on your door. Make sure. And so what left on that night was not just Jewish people, but what's called a mixed multitude, a group of people from all nations left and went out into the wilderness. But Pharaoh hadn't had enough yet. If you want, how many slides have we got? Yeah, we can finish it next week. Do a bit more detail on the. Is that okay?
Rather than rushing it now.
Yeah. Shall we leave it there? Next week, then, what we'll do is the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, the crossing of the Red Sea is a very dramatic story. But what we'll just finish up with here tonight is this thought. Why do you think that God chose to stop the angel going into a door and killing people by using the blood of a lamb? We've done this in previous cycles of these studies. What does the lamb, or should I say, who does the lamb represent? Jesus. And what happened to Jesus?
Jesus died on a cross.
Died on a cross, exactly right. And he bled. And his blood, in a way, saves us. And that was the symbol. You see, when Jesus died, he died at exactly the same time of year as this happened. So this happened in the month Abib, the Jewish month Abib. And over 1,000 years later, in the same month, in the same week, almost the same day. Actually, it was the same day, wasn't it? It was the same day, the very same, in fact, the same hour, Jesus died. And because he died, other people didn't. It's almost as if the angel of death avoids anywhere where the blood of Jesus is. And that's not to say that God is looking for us to splash blood, and that's the sort of God he is. He likes blood and stuff. He's making a point, a special point about what humanity needs to do to avoid death. And it involves understanding what Jesus Christ's sacrifice was all about. Way back in the story, God was talking about the sacrifice of Jesus. Isn't that amazing and wonderful? All right, we'll leave it there for tonight.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. So if you bring your notes next week also, so we'll continue this study on next week and finish it off next week rather than rushing it this evening. Okay, we might just close with prayer. Almighty Creator God, the great God of heaven and earth, we acknowledge you and praise you at this time. And we know that from the very beginning of time, from the creation of this earth, that you had a plan and a purpose, and you had mapped out how things would happen. And you had always planned for the coming of your dear Son as the Saviour of the world. Just as you have planned for the time when he will return to this earth to set up your kingdom upon this earth. We thank you for the things we have opportunity to learn in Jesus Christ, our Lord's name. Amen.